Okay, guys, we are going to read our social studies assignment today, which is chapter 6, lesson 3, California becomes a state. You could find that on page 246 of your textbook, or you could follow along with me on the screen. San Francisco was just a small, quiet town when you arrived 8 months ago. Now, in 1849, it's the largest city in the West. You were part of the gold rush that created this population boom in California. You and others are now beginning to talk about California's becoming a state. California leaders have called a meeting in Monterey to discuss statehood. You are excited and also nervous about California's future. The Monterey Convention. In 1847, the United States took control of California. Since that time, California has been ruled by United States military officials. Under military rule, Californians had no rights except those given them by the military governor. At first, people had not complained much about military rule. Then, the gold rush brought tens of thousands of newcomers from the United States to California. They wanted the same rights in California as they had in the United States. So did many of the people who had already been living in California. At this time, the United States Congress was busy dealing with rising conflicts over slavery and other issues between the northern states and the southern states. Its members were not able to pass laws that would create a new government for California. General Bennett Riley, the new military governor of California, decided to call for a convention. At this important meeting, to be held in Monterey, decisions would be made about California's future. Delegates were elected to attend the convention. A delegate is a person chosen to speak and act for the people who elected him or her. I'm going to read the caption here. The delegates who met at Monterey represented people from all parts of California. The delegates came from different backgrounds but worked together to make decisions for all Californians. The 48 delegates to the Monterey Convention met in Colton Hall, the only building in California at the time large enough to hold such a gathering. Do you think that's why they chose Monterey? Because San Francisco is the biggest place in the West. I'm surprised they didn't hold it there, right? A Constitution for California. Californians elected 48 delegates to attend the convention. They included both new immigrants and members of old California families, such as Mariano Guadalupe Vallejo. Remember him? He was one of the rancho owners. Vallejo had lived in California since the time of Spanish rule. He was one of 8 Californios elected to the convention. The delegates quickly decided that California should become a state. Next, they had to decide what land would become the state of California. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo had set California's southern border with Mexico. The Pacific Ocean formed the state's western boundary. The northern border was the Oregon Territory. It was the eastern boundary that the delegates had to set. So the boundary being the border. The decision about the eastern border was one of the most important that the delegates had to make. Should California include all of the land the United States had gained from Mexico? So if you remember that, parts of Arizona, Nevada, I think even Wyoming were included in that. That's a really big area. The delegates decided against this. They thought that the area would be too large to govern. They decided that the eastern boundary of California should be marked by the Sierra Nevada and the Colorado River. So I would just add that that's a common way that people create their borders is they use the landscape and natural landforms to help them. Rivers are a common border in mountain ranges. Another decision the delegates faced was whether California would be a slave state or a free state. In slave states, people were allowed to own slaves. In free states, they were not. All of the delegates voted that California should be a free state. The delegates also made decisions about education in the new state. They called for the creation of a state public school system. These decisions and others were written into a constitution. or plan of government for the new state. In just 6 weeks, the delegates wrote the Constitution of 1849. It gave Californians new rights and freedoms. For the first time, California citizens would have a voice in their own government. They could now vote for their leaders, such as a governor and members of the state legislature. A legislature is a group of officials elected to make laws. So in our country, the legislative branch is the U.S. Congress, the Senate, and the House of Representatives. And then within the states, they also have their own state legislature, or like a Congress for the state. In November 1849, the people of California voted to ratify or approve the new Constitution. They elected state lawmakers, including Mariano Guadalupe Vallejo. In addition, they chose Peter H. Burnett to be the first state governor. So there he is, the first governor of California. Let's go back up and look at those other sidebars before we move on. So here's a picture. The caption says, "The members of the first graduating class of the first high school in San Francisco, shown here in 1859, were among the first people to benefit from California's public school system." So that's not a very big graduating class, is it? But I think it's good to see that both women or men were included. And again, it's a public school system, which means it's like a free system of schooling for everyone. Clearly not everyone's taking advantage of it, but it's not like private tutors coming to your rancho like it had been in the past, right? Over on this page, you've got a sidebar that says democratic values. Being able to own your own property is a right that people value. In California's Constitution of 1849, only white men over the age of 21 were allowed to vote. So yay, Californians get to choose their leaders, but not every Californian. You had to be a white man over the age of 21. This was true in the rest of the United States as well. Unlike most other state constitutions, however, the California Constitution did give women the right to own property. This was a tradition in California from the time of Mexican rule. So I remember we talked about that when we were reading about Mexico ruling California and allowing women to own land. So they didn't want to change that, even though commonly in the United States, women were not allowed to own land. They thought, well, this had been something we've been doing for a long time. It would be it would cause a lot of trouble, a lot of problems if we changed that rule suddenly. So they kept it. The delegates at the Monterey Convention included this right as Article 11, Section 14 of the Constitution of 1849. Today, all citizens of the United States have the right to own property. So then we've got a picture of a woman, and it says, California's Constitution granted Nancy Kelsey and other women in California many rights that women in other parts of the United States did not have. So they have the right to own property. It says many rights. I wonder what other rights that would include, though. Because it's not the right to vote, right? So I'm going to read this sidebar first, the points of view one. Government leaders had different points of view about California statehood. So these are not members of the Monterey Convention. These are senators in the U.S. federal government. So the ones in Washington, D.C., like the president and then the people that we elect and send there. So once California has created this constitution and it's ratified, then they send their request to become a state to the U.S. Congress, where they have to vote to allow this to happen. One of the issues that the people in the United States Congress, the senators in the House of Representatives, again, the issue of slavery came up. So California wanted to become, remember, a free state. They all voted unanimously, which means every single one of them voted free state. And then these senators in the U.S. government are going to have a problem with that. So this senator from Kentucky, Henry Clay, says, California ought, upon her application to be admitted as one of the states, without any restriction in respect to the exclusion or introduction of slavery. So, in other words, he's saying, just don't mention slavery at all. John C. Calhoun, a senator from South Carolina, said, the North is making efforts to appropriate, which means take the whole California and other territories to herself by excluding the South from every foot of it. What do you think? Do you think he is wanting slavery or not slavery? So in the Civil War, remember the North was anti-slavery and the South was pro-slavery. William Gwynn, one of the first senators from California, he's remembering, as soon as our Constitution is ratified by the people, we will send our senators and representatives to the Congress of the United States to demand admission to the Union. So this is telling us about that process. So they're going to go try to be part of the United States. The 31st state, spoiler alert, but I think we all know that what's going to happen, right? After the elections in 1849, California's 2 senators went to Washington, D.C. There, they asked Congress to allow California to join the United States. Congress is the part of the United States government that makes laws. California's request set up a huge debate. At that time, the United States had the same number of free states as slave states. So 30 states were part of the United States at that time. 15 were free states and 15 were slave states. Most free states were in the North and most slave states were in the South. Southerners did not want to break this balance by letting California join as a free state. So if you think about North and South, California is, it shares a southern border with Mexico. So California would be considered a southern state. Finally, members of Congress worked out a compromise. People on each side of the argument agreed to give up something. So under the Compromise of 1850, California joined the Union as a free state. In exchange, Congress passed a law, the Fugitive Slave Act, that said anyone who was caught helping an escaped slave would be punished. So this is kind of a big deal. This affects the entire country. So the bargain they made in Congress with the slave states was, okay, so if you let California join as a free state like they want, then we'll pass this act that says no matter where you are in the country, if you find someone who had escaped slavery, and you try to help them remain free, then that's breaking the law, which sounds like not a very moral decision, does it? California officially became a state on September 9th, 1850. The new state government faced some early challenges. First, it had to choose a location for the state capital. The capital was moved from Monterey to San Jose. Then it was moved from Vallejo and later to Benicia. Finally, in 1854, the capital of California was moved to Sacramento. So it doesn't really say why they moved it, but that's kind of interesting. It would be interesting to find out. Another big challenge had to do with taxes. A large part of the population in California were people such as miners who did not own land. As a result, the state was not able to collect enough property taxes to pay its bills. Also, banks in other parts of the United States did not want to lend money to banks in California. So paying its bills. What kind of bills do you think they had to pay? I guess public school. States governments offer social services like police and fire. You have to pay the guys in the government. You have to pay to create streets, trash pickup. I don't know what kind of things like that existed, but today those are the kind of things our tax dollars go to. Mail systems, stuff like that. So they're not making enough money because they're taxing property owners. And if you don't own property, you're not paying taxes. So they're not bringing enough in, which is interesting to me because that means women who own property were paying taxes even though they couldn't vote. The end of the ranchos. The state government also faced troubles over land ownership. Many people who stayed in California after the gold rush lived on unmarked lands that were part of ranchos. This led to arguments over who owned the land. To settle these disputes, the United States Congress passed the Land Act of 1851. This law said that the rancheros or rancho owners had to prove the land belonged to them. So when you're a rancho owner and all these people come in and they're digging gold on your property, and then all of a sudden they're like, yeah, this is where I live now. And you're like, no, this is my land. Well, Congress said, okay, you can keep that land. You got to prove it's yours. However, this was hard for some of the rancheros to do. Most of them did not speak English. They were still Spanish speaking, and few government officials spoke Spanish. It was also difficult for some rancheros to prove that they had received their land grants legally. Most had received their grants when California was ruled by Mexico. In addition, hand-drawn diseños were often not correct. So remember, if you wanted the Mexican government to give you a rancho, you had to write a letter, and then you had to draw your diseño, and then they would grant it to you. But they're looking at these documents from Mexico and they don't really understand them. They're written in Spanish. And then they have these hand-drawn maps that are like, see this tree right here? This is where my land extends to. Like, it's not exactly the most accurate map. So it was hard to really prove that that was your land. So here's California celebrating statehood. Californians did not learn about their statehood until October 18, 1850. On that day, Helen Crosby and a group of California leaders arrived in Monterey aboard the steamship Oregon. In the folds of her umbrella, she carried the official document granting California statehood. So remember, information takes a while to travel from one side of the country to the other. So even though it was September 9th, they didn't get that information that they were actually a state until October 18th. So back to the rancheros. Many rancheros had to hire lawyers and had to sell their lands to pay their bills. In the end, most large ranchos were broken up. The fight over land ownership affected the state's population as well. Because of the long legal arguments, many people who might have settled in California decided not to. Among the state of California's early leaders were Pablo de la Guerra, Salvador Vallejo, and Andres Pico. That's some of the early leaders of California. So these ranchos are kind of coming to an end. They're losing their land because they can't prove it's theirs, or because they have to sell some of their land to pay lawyers to fight for their land. A lot of people thought it was just too much of a hassle and didn't even bother, and maybe moved away to other places. So the last part I'm going to read is on page, I think it's 253, and it's about this woman named Biddy Mason. So it's a short little biography, and it's kind of an interesting information. It starts with a quote under her name. It says, "If you hold your hand closed, nothing good can come in. The open hand is blessed, for it gives in abundance, even as it receives." In 1818, Bridget Biddy Mason was born into slavery on the Georgia plantation of Robert Smith. In 1851, Smith moved his household to San Bernardino in Southern California. When Smith wanted to move to Texas, a slave state, Mason fought to stay in California and be free. In 1856, the courts granted freedom to Mason. So what happened is she was a slave in Georgia. They moved to California, and in California, slavery was not allowed. So then Smith decided to move to Texas instead, where slavery was allowed, and she didn't want to go, which makes sense. I wouldn't want to go either. So she fought to California. She took it to court to stay in California. Like, this is a free state. You can't make me be a slave anymore. You can't make me go to Texas with this guy. So that's kind of a cool thing the California courts decided. For the first time in her life, Mason was allowed to work for herself. She got a job as a nurse. With the money she earned, Mason bought land in what became downtown Los Angeles. She eventually made a fortune by buying, selling, and renting land. So not only did she get her freedom, but in California, women and even Black women were allowed to be landowners. And so she worked hard and did that. I actually read a book about her recently, and it was really, really interesting, like all the amazing things she did with her life. It says Biddy Mason used her money to help others. She paid the bills for her church and bought food and clothes for those in need. She also helped set up the first school for African American children in Los Angeles. So she's a pretty cool woman. Over here, it says the 1866 deed that gave Biddy Mason ownership of property in Los Angeles. So there's the deed in which she bought property. And then on the bottom is a timeline of her life. So it didn't tell us this in the story, but it says here in 18 Mason and her daughters win their freedom. So it wasn't just for herself, but she also had her family with her that she was trying to keep out of slavery as well. All right, so that's the end of the chapter for today.